and welcome back to the ESPC Property Show. I'm one of your hosts, Megan, and I'm with...
So you are, and I'm one of your hosts, Paul.
So today's episode is really good. I know we say that all the time, but we're a bit biased, but we thought it was a really good episode.
We certainly did. Andy Maciver, how can I describe him? He makes politics fun and interesting.
Yep. And he's got a wealth of experience in politics, so we invited him on to discuss kind of the current political landscape, things like the Westminster election, how that might affect the Scottish political landscape, and then obviously one of the devolved issues, which is housing, and that's obviously what we were most interested in. So,
didn't pull his punches, talks a lot about the up-and-coming bills and what that might mean, and it goes into... We got some really great insights, and it goes into a lot of detail and a lot of things, but all of it's entertaining. You're going to like this, we promise you.
Yeah, here's the episode.
So, welcome our guest today. We are honoured. The man who's been on TV, the man who knows everything about politics and is here with us today, Andy Maciver, founder director of Message Matters. But you had a life before that as well, didn't you, Andy?
A little bit, yes. I realised earlier this year I've now been in and around politics for longer than I haven't. So I'm 44 and I first went to work in the Scottish Parliament when I was 22.
Is that right?
Yeah, so half a life ago is when I first went into politics for the first time. So so I worked for a political party for a while. I worked for David McLetchie, who was leader of the Scottish Tory Party. And I did that for 5 years or so. I was their head of communications, so I did speech writing and media and policy and various things like that.
Saying the wrong things.
I then left. I went to the bank. I did government relations and PR for Bank of Scotland corporate during the housing crisis, which then led to the collapse of the bank, obviously, and the takeover by Lloyd. So I was there through that whole period, which was really interesting, actually, from a professional point of view.
Absolutely.
It was really interesting. And then I did departure and I worked for the Royal College of Surgeons for a while, which is a bit different. But again, really orientated a lot. I was membership and comms director, but orientated a lot towards policy and health and that sort of thing. But during that time, I tried to help a guy called Murdo Fraser to abolish the Scottish Tory Party, actually, and to start a new political party, which I still think is quite a relevant thing. And then during that period, I started the company. So the company's been going now for just over 12 years.
Wow.
That's the potted history.
That's some history.
And that's where we are.
And I suppose 22 years ago, was it very different?
Yeah, I mean, it was a different building for a start.
Yeah,
so that was
true.
a bit. So it was up in the top of the Royal Mile, which is now a luxury hotel, although it's got scaffolding around it, so you wouldn't know. But it was in an old council building there, and the chamber was at the General Assembly. So quite different, but a different vibe as well, because it was a pre-independence era.
I'm trying to get a timeline for that. Yeah. What?
So the Parliament started in '99.
Yeah.
And basically, I think you can kind of split devolution in half and say that from 99 till 2011, it was all quite stable and quite policy orientated under Labour Lib Dems, and then under the Alex Salmond government from 2007. But then the second half of devolution from 2011 until now
real drive
has been completely focused on independence on both sides. So it's been focused on anti-independence and pro-independence and very light on policy.
Yes.
And that has been because the SNP got their majority and then got a referendum. So devolution has been very split. It's been a real game of two halves in devolution so far, I think. But that focus on independence and the lack of focus on some policy areas actually does come back to some of the things we might talk about today, because a lot of it comes back to housing policy.
Absolutely.
Not just housing. In lots of areas, there's been lots of lack of policy focus on all sides, opposition and government. But housing is an example of that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll come to housing, and clearly, as you say, it's a period of two halves, and there's definitely going to be a replay at some point. I guess it's not over yet, is it? The debate around independence, but we may touch upon some of that. But probably the first thing to really talk about then is the current political timetable. Where are we just in the cycle of elections and things, for those that maybe aren't 100% clear in it?
So there are things that we know and things that we don't know. We know when the next Scottish Parliament election is, so that's May 2026. So we've got almost exactly 2 years from now until then. Yeah. So we will definitely get a Scottish Parliament election, and of course housing is devolved. So from that point of view, that's very relevant to you guys and to listeners. But in the middle of that, of course, there will be a Westminster election as well. Yeah. Now that bit we don't know yet. We know it must be before January of 2025. There is a lot of debate as to when it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, Labour tried to sort of almost bully the Tories into it.
Labour are desperate to have it right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're flying high in the polls. They're clearly going to win the election. I mean, it's almost certain they're going to, I would say with 99% certain, Labour will be the largest party It's a little bit less certain they'll have a majority, but it's 99% certain they'll be the largest party in the parliament. So obviously they just want the election now. They're in a bit of trouble, Labour, especially over the Israel and Gaza stuff. It's causing some internal difficulties. So they don't really want to drag that out much further. They'd rather just get in there, get the election and get into government. So that's, they want it now. And there are some sections of the Tory party who want it now as well.
Oh, really?
Because they want out of government and to again. Be able to blank sheet of paper start again with a new direction of travel that they think is a better direction than it's going in at the moment. And some of them just want this all to be over because they know it's all. They know they're going to lose anyway. So why drag this out? So there's a bit of a feeling of that. Rishi Sunak himself does not. I mean, he seems to be, and from what I hear from people I speak to down there, he's getting pretty cheesed off with everything, as you might expect. But he wants to go later into the autumn.
In the hope that something happens, or
I think
there's
politicians are always optimistic, and they quite often get themselves in a bit of a bubble. And I think you have to be in a bit of a bubble to think that the Tories can do anything that's going to pull this out of the bag and win the election. Now, a lot of them think that changing leader will do that, and that's what you see, sort of a psychodrama playing out at the moment amongst the party at Westminster, because they think we'll get somebody else in, and miraculously that'll have us win the election. I mean, I think that's unreal. And usually focused on immigration, and that's the sort of main focus of that wing of the party that thinks they can get somebody else in to be stronger than that, and they'll suddenly win.
Just be in power for too long, and in the end,
I think
just let's get a change.
There's history of this all the way along. I mean, it happened to Labour in 2010 at Westminster. It was not the Labour government under Blair and then Brown was not an unsuccessful government. It achieved quite a lot, particularly in health and education. I think it did okay. The economy had gone through the economic crash, but Labour under Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling were thought to have handled that, given the scale of the of the interruption in economic normality, they were thought to have handled that quite well. Gordon Brown was not the most charismatic Prime Minister, which probably didn't help. But generally speaking, it was, it had been 13 years. It had just been a while. And sometimes when it gets to that sort of stage, you do, you lose the impetus, you get tired, you run out of ideas. And that just does happen to political parties. It happened to the Tories in 97, it happened to Labour in 2010. There's no question it's happened to the Tories now. Yes. I mean, they're not really doing anything external at the moment. It's all internally focused stuff. And
I think to get the flights to Rwanda going on.
I mean, and there's not a huge attachment to the world outside.
No.
There's a lot of bunker mentality. The bubble around Westminster is pretty strong at the moment, and there's not a lot of focus on what's going on outside, and so they don't really have any ideas.
No.
And you can see signs of that in the Scottish government up here as well. Of course, that's been 17 years, a remarkably long period of time to be in government, and they are also tired. I'm not sure they're at the same point in the cycle that the Tories are at, because they're not as disliked in Scotland as the Tories are
2 years to
go
in
the UK, but there are 2 years to go, so you just don't know quite where that's going to go.
And do you think we'll get a read for some of this with the Westminster elections then? How the SNP
you definitely will. Yes, there will be. It will not be. It's not going to be a cut and shut job. We don't know exactly that it's going to be decided entirely at Westminster. You can't predict completely what will then happen at Holyrood, because what happens in the Westminster election to the SNP will potentially change what the SNP are doing here.
Do you think? Yeah.
So, I think broadly speaking, there are sort of three categories of what might happen in the Westminster election. So I think just to go slightly back, I do think it will be round about end of September, October. I think that's a sensible time for the Tories to hold it. They'll have, people aren't worried about their heating bills at that point, which are still pretty difficult for people. Certainly now with, it's not exactly been the warmest few weeks. I think they'll wait for that. Summertime is generally a time when people are feeling a little bit happier with life generally, and that all helps when it comes to elections. And I also think that they can let Labour continue the little bit of infighting that they're getting into, and it probably just is the optimum time for Sunak to get as many votes as he can. He's not going to win, but he might lose better in September or October than he would lose just now. And it'll give him a couple of years in the job. So I mean, I think that's when it'll be. There are broadly three things that could happen between the SNP and Labour. So I think you can. There are 57 seats up for grabs in Scotland. Of that 57, I think you can presume the Tories and the Lib Dems are likely to hold the 10 that they've got between them. They're both straight fights with the SNP, and the SNP vote is going down, and so it's not likely, although the Tory vote's going down as well, it's going down a little bit slower in Scotland than the SNP vote is. So they are favourites to hold those 10 seats, which leaves sort of 45 to 47 seats up for grabs. If the SNP lose the election to Labour, if Labour get more seats than the SNP, in order for the SNP to try to rescue themselves for the Holyrood election, they're going to have to do something quite substantial here to basically say, okay, if Hamza Yousaf's going to keep his job, he's going to have to stand up and say to his own party, I know I've got this wrong, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to put it right.
That's a big statement to make, isn't it?
It's probably the only way at that point that he can actually keep his job. If they lose, leaders don't tend to survive election losses.
Sure.
And if they have a loss to Labour in that election, then he's going to have to do something radical. That may involve breaking up the coalition. It might involve bringing some of the other people who are not included in his government, people like Kate Forbes and Ivan McKee and maybe even Fergus Ewing and people like that, back into the fold, try to bring the party back together in the hope that they can spend a couple of years or by then 18 months
managing different messages,
trying to get improvement and get the poll ratings back up for Holyrood. But it might be the case that the election is quite close at Westminster, but the SNP maybe just edge ahead of Labour. Labour actually lose, but the SNP also lose a lot of seats at the same time. And maybe at that point Hamza Yousaf stays on but doesn't change all that much. So yes, the election will have a big the election at Westminster will have a big bearing on what happens at Holyrood.
Wow.
Because it will change a lot of the behaviour of the political parties here in terms of what they do. They'll know a lot more. At the moment, it's just polls. It's all just polling. So, until you have a real... And they had a test at the by-election in Rutherglen, which pointed towards Labour doing obviously a lot better. But until they actually have that electoral test, until the electorate comes and punches you in the face, you don't really know for sure that that's what they want to do. They have been,
many a time.
Now the polls are all going, or almost all of them are going in a certain direction, which is pointing towards heavy losses for the SNP and heavy gains for Labour. But you don't know until it's actually happened. And there's, as I say, there's nothing quite like the reality of an election to make you then change your behaviour. So I think it will be very instructive, but I think it might also change what they do, which might influence what happens in 2026.
Wow. Okay, we're going to get you back in.
Yeah, absolutely. So Andy, obviously the key area of politics that we're interested in is the housing.
Yes.
What's happening with in the housing sector. How high up of the political agenda do you think housing is just now?
Well, I think it's higher just now than it has, not necessarily for the right reasons, which we can go into, but I think it is quite high up the agenda at the moment, actually. There is a dedicated Minister for Housing, Paul McLennan. He's very competent, he's very credible. He used to run East Lothian Local Authority, so he, because housing is also, large parts of it are devolved and planning is devolved and so on to local authorities. He knows the patch very, very well. So he's he's a very competent minister. The dealings I've always had with him lead me to believe there's not a lot he doesn't know about what's going on in his area.
He's certainly high profile as well. We've seen him a lot more things than maybe previous ministers, shall we say?
Yeah, he does, and he's not afraid to put his head above the parapet either. So he's very visible, he's very vocal, and he's very competent. So that's good, and that does raise the profile of housing. I think housing personally should be a cabinet level post, because if you look at the things that really affect people in their day-to-day lives, education, transport, health, housing, the economy, those. I think housing is up there with those things.
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
Transport has just been made a cabinet post for the first time.
Is crime?
It is, yeah. I mean, and it always should be there in the cabinet. But actually, I reckon if you poll people and say what's the bigger concern to you in your day-to-day life, housing or crime, I bet you more people say housing than crime.
I think right now, we've heard the word housing crisis mentioned
absolutely.
a few times.
So it's a big issue, and I think it could do with being higher profile, but it's certainly moving up the agenda. I suppose the question is it moving up the agenda always for the right reasons or for the wrong reasons? And at the moment, I think that the housing crisis can pretty much be summed up in being a supply issue.
End of story.
Yeah.
That's what this is, right? This is a supply problem, and whether it's private family homes, whether it's for rent, whether it's social housing, it's all the same. There's not enough.
And it's not happened overnight, is it? We've been building or not building to this for a long time, haven't we?
Yeah.
And so what you really want is for policymakers to say, okay, let's not make this complicated. We know exactly what the problem is. The problem is supply.
Build more property.
You can drill a little bit deeper into that and say, right, exactly what lack of supply do we have in all these different areas of private, of family, of flats, of buy to rent, of all that. Where are the supply shortages, and then let's deal with them. I think where politics becomes involved, and it has become quite involved recently, is actually with the Butte House Agreement, which is the agreement between the Green Party and the SNP. The Green Party is a very successful political party. It's done extremely well since 2021 and has extracted a huge amount of power in government. But it's a very left-wing party, and the people who are calling the shots in the Green Party don't support the concept of making profit from property ownership. And that core concept of being unsupportive of profiting from property ownership has quite a lot of consequences in terms of policy making. So a lot of that is why, for example, we've seen rent freezes and rent caps in the private rented sector. That's driven by that ideology. Now again, let's go back to the core of we don't have enough supply. So what we really don't want to do is do things that reduce the supply even further.
Create the right environment, don't we?
You know, obviously you deal more with purchase than rent, but you do deal with rental as well. And you know, we know in the rental sector that, especially in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the supply has gone down.
Landlords have disappeared. You know,
landlords are disappearing.
Never want to get political, but the fact is, there is definitely landlords left the market.
And the thing is, this isn't political. This is data. So we know that there are fewer landlords because they feel it's a hostile environment, so they don't want to be involved anymore, so they sell up, and that reduces the supply of that side of the sector. But there's the other things, there's the unknown unknowns, I suppose, as well, which is that, you know, we know there are lots of institutional investors who would be wanting to build to rent. You know, if you've got a pension fund who's got a tenement, a build to rent block to build somewhere, are they going to do it in Birmingham or are they going to do it in Edinburgh? Well, they're going to do it in Birmingham because their return is better. Because there's no rent cap.
Not the right environment.
So, you know, this is now well established and well known. And there's a question for policymakers as to how they elegantly reverse out of what has been a disastrous policy. So we know that has had, you know, we know that policy has an impact in that respect. And we've seen a lot more recently as well with the heat and buildings strategy and consultations. They've got to watch a similar effect doesn't come in there as well.
This is it. No one's setting out to negatively disrupt the market. I'm sure the people that advocated rent controls were doing it for the right reasons, you know, part of it, I say ideology, but I think they're trying to make things better for the tenant, but as you say, it really hasn't, there's no evidence it's worked. There's no evidence it's worked.
There will be isolated cases where a tenant has, you know, paid less as a result of it, and during a tenancy, obviously, because there's a cap, that, you know, during a tenancy, the tenants will definitely be doing better, but you know, we elect politicians and ministers to make difficult calls and tough decisions, and the volume of tenants who are doing better because they're in a lease is outweighed by the volume who are not because there's no supply, or because, you know, somebody's moved out of that flat and suddenly what was a £695 one bedroom flat is now suddenly a £995 one bedroom flat because the landlord knows they can't increase the rent. So, you know, you have to be able to. You have to be a strong leader at the same time and say, right, okay, I know that's not working now, and I'm going to hold my hands up and say, we got that one wrong, so now we're going to make it right. So there are lots of things. Housing is it's not a doddle. I'm not pretending it's straightforward. You know, policy making in housing is complex, but you've got to make sure you don't make it worse when you're trying to make it better. The vast majority of, I've been around politicians of all parties for, as I say, over 20 years. The vast majority of politicians I've come across are in it for the right reasons. They want to do good things and they want to make life better for people. That particular example isn't making life better for people.
No, and I think, you know, the seeds of this, I think if you go back to the right to buy back in the 80s, people buying the council houses, and those properties were never replaced. And so it starts a long time ago, doesn't it? And now more people live alone. So this is it feels like a big social issue, doesn't it, really? And it's whoever's in power is going to be faced with the same challenges. And I think fundamentally, I think we need to build more council property. The
thing is, we need to build more everything, right? Because one of the biggest complaints about housing, whether it's rental or whether it's purchase, one of the biggest complaints that normal people in the street have is I can't afford it, it's too expensive. You know, I can't afford my deposit from a mortgage. How am I supposed to get that? I can't do it. How am I going to get 10, 20, 25% deposit on the average house, which is, you know, I'm going to need 30, 40, 50,000 pounds of cash and I don't have it. And the same is true with renters. So, you know, we know where the problems are, but you know, properties that are too expensive, whether it's rental or purchase, the way to bring the price down is for the market to provide more property.
Absolutely.
Supply up, price down. So this is it's quite basic in some ways, to be honest with you. And I think that's where policymakers need to start with housing.
I think so.
Is to say, what the problem is supply,
which
so
is the
we
problem
need
we're
to
trying to
create
fix.
more supply.
Yeah, we're
That's
tinkering
it.
around the edges. Everything's a remedy. As you say, get to the cure, fix the problem. And the problem is there's a supply. You know,
and there's no doubt that at the moment, my analysis of policymakers in the Parliament, in government, but also to a degree in opposition as well, is they're not focusing on that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're focusing. They're not.
Taxation, or maybe we'll do this.
It's very much cure rather than prevention, and that's why you get rent caps. Rent caps is cure. Supply is prevention.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think there is that element of focus. But elections can bring that sort of focus forward. To be honest with you.
So we did touch on some of the other things there, as you say. If we talk about maybe the heating and buildings bill, which is an interesting one. I mean, we as ESPC have been involved in some of those discussions. Yeah, what's your read on this? I mean, I think this has been driven by the 2040 commitment, is it now?
Yeah, the net zero commitment, 2045, I think the overall national commitment is. But there are obviously other dates, 2028, 2032, the various dates that are relevant to those involved in the housing sector in terms of when they have to decarbonise. I think, in fairness to the government, large aspects of the overall strategy are correct. So we know where the big emissions come from in terms of climate change. They come from effectively domestic transport and domestic homes. Those are two enormous issues. And they do have to be fixed. And you can see from a domestic transport point of view what the direction of travel is there. It's towards electric vehicles and all of that sort of thing. And that's proving hard enough. And if you think conversion from internal combustion to electric vehicles is hard, let's have a look at the infrastructure requirements for conversion from gas or oil heating to
district
zero emissions heating. So this is something which is an enormous piece of infrastructure and very difficult. So the aim of moving in that direction is the right aim, because you can't get to net zero and you can't decarbonise until you change the heating source of homes.
Correct.
Right? So I think everybody would accept that.
I think everyone's every political party we've spoken to is on the same page with that. No one's fighting against that. It's the how.
It's the how and the when.
Yeah.
And again, you know, at the end of the day, if you put all your eggs, let's say, in the ground source heat pump basket, you're then saying to people, you need to fund a new piece of infrastructure for your home. Yeah. And it's going to cost you 10, 12, 15,000 pounds. And I need you to do it in the next 4 years. Well, how many people can do that? You know, you're looking at a short list of people who have the individual finance to be able to say, sure, that's fine. You know, that's fine. We'll do that. No problem. I mean, it's not realistic, and you have to say to yourself, okay, so what other options are there? And this is where you have to try to be practical about it. You know, do you put all your eggs in the basket of ground source heat pumps, or do you look at other alternatives? Yep. Do you look at some district hydrogen options, or do you look at other options to get that in there without the massive infrastructure spend? And then, of course, you look at the other side of it. We're sitting here in Edinburgh, where the planning is very restrictive. There are some, I live in a Victorian property, right? Can I get a ground source heat pump? Not without planning permission.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Will they give it planning permission? Well, they might do, because there's a strategic imperative, but you don't really know. There are other complications to this. It's not just a click of the finger to make these things happen. Yeah. So I think that in that sense, the aim is right, but again, there's got to be a bit of creativity about how you actually achieve that, and how you get there, because there's a lot of balancing here. There's protection of natural assets, like again we're talking here in Edinburgh. You know, these planning laws are there for a reason. You know, you don't want to go into the Newtown to Georgian. You don't want to go to Georgian properties in Newtown and see solar panels all over the roof, right? You know, nobody wants to see that. Yes. So you have to be pragmatic and be balanced. But what we might get to the point of, and I know that you guys have done a lot on this from the point of view of selling property as well, and EPC ratings, we might get to the point of actually effectively disallowing people from participation, because they actually physically can't do the things to their property the government are needing them to do, either because of planning restrictions or financial restrictions or whatever it might be. We've got to watch we don't get to that point, because that's not really fair on anybody, and it also doesn't get us closer to net zero, which is the point of all this.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I do think I think the government's consulting early on this, which is good, and they appear to be listening so far to opposing views, or certainly alternative ideas,
Yeah.
which I think is incredibly important. And we do have a bit of time to get this
Yeah.
right. I think the district heating idea, which we've spoken about on the show before now, is an interesting one, isn't it? Where the heat is actually pumped in from central source for buildings, thus removing the need for your own individual ground source or air source heat pump. So, yeah, I think creativity and just working with industry, I think, may bring some of the solutions. But you're right, I think imposing something on a buyer when they buy the property, which is one of the things that's been suggested, I think that could have a really negative impact on the entire property market. And as a consequence on LBTT revenues and everything else, so that, unintended consequences, people can't move, the things get blighted. There's a lot of thought that's needed, I think, to go into that side.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
but we will get there, I'm sure. Is there any other bills in the mix or anything else that you want to talk about on the housing side?
Well, I think probably we've covered the things that are specific to housing, but of course, a lot of what's going on in Scotland just now is predicated on the fact that we need the economy to grow.
Yes.
There is just not, and that's not a Scottish only problem, it's throughout the UK. The UK is not actually performing all that well.
Do you think we're slowly just getting poorer as a nation?
Yeah,
the UK, when you compare us to the rest of the world, you sort of go around some other places now and you think, God, look at their infrastructure, look at even the shopping malls, look at the trains, look at it. It feels like we're starting to feel like we're maybe moving down the league table.
I think that Scotland and the UK as a whole is really degrading. I think we're rotting away. I think that we're not very good at looking outside our borders anyway. We tend to compare ourselves with other people inside our borders. So we Scots will compare ourselves with the English and say, well, we're better than them, so that's fine, we're doing okay. But we're worse than everybody else. Yeah. So I think we need to. You're right though. I mean, you know what it's like when you go anywhere else in the world. You think, you
go to Switzerland or Germany or Hong Kong or Spain. You think actually.
But there is a lot of decay, and a lot of it is down to sclerotic economic growth. Because ultimately, all of the stuff that we're talking about, you've got to pay for it somehow, and you're only going to pay for it if the economy is growing. And if the country is booming, but you just have to look outside at the potholes. We talked. I was on TV the other night talking about Glasgow actually, and the real problems Glasgow's got just with litter and general mess and degradation inside the city. We are, and this is not, as I say, it's not a Scottish only problem. You can do the same thing down south. You can go to a lot of cities down in England and see similar things happening. We are not. This country is not performing well. Infrastructure is very, very weak. Yeah. All sorts of infrastructure is weak. Digital, physical, extremely weak.
I mean, you look at London, you wonder about the Victorian, well, look at the underground, look at the sewerage systems, everything, and it's those things that can get kicked down the road when you get into government, I guess, because there's other priorities more pressing, and some of this is invisible to the point it's not, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I think so. I think that probably more people have to take a trip outside the borders sometimes and see what things are like elsewhere, and come back here and get a bit. I think people are entitled to be pretty angry at the moment about how we're performing as a nation. As I say, I don't mean just Scotland. I mean Scotland and the UK as countries. I think people are entitled to ask some questions as to why we're just not doing better. Because it's easy to blame things on COVID and say it's all a COVID hangover, COVID this, COVID that, COVID the other thing. But COVID was global. COVID wasn't just here, and a lot of other peers are doing an awful lot better than us.
Do you think Brexit has had some impact beyond?
No question.
I mean, certainly it's in terms of the labour shortage. That's definite, isn't it? There's no question that's had an issue.
It's also had an impact on growth. I mean, it's less easy to be crystal clear about exactly what the scale of the impact is. But I think you'd be a brave Brexiteer to say that we are doing better economically as a result of Brexit. That's not to say we won't.
Yeah.
Because in fairness, Brexit does provide some opportunity. There's a cost to it, but there is a potential benefit to it, and it provides opportunities to do things and to go into places that we weren't able to do as part of the single market and customs union. We're certainly not exploiting that at the moment. No. And it's also unclear that even if we do exploit that to its fullest potential, would it have been as good as staying in one of the three biggest markets in the world, the Europe, China and the US? So I think it's a difficult case to make. Brexit hasn't helped, no question. COVID hasn't helped, no question. But do they in themselves explain our generally poor performance in the UK? I don't think that is enough of an explanation.
So what would you... You're in charge now, Andy. We've put you in charge of UK PLC. What would you do?
Well, as I say, every single thing that we want to try to achieve hinges, I think, on an economy and a growing economy. So we have to drive economic growth. I suspect that involves more tax cuts rather than tax increases. I think we're reaching for tax increases all the time at the moment to try to fund things.
Probably more so in Scotland as well.
Probably more so in Scotland,
again,
but I think that we know that is actually putting economic growth down rather than putting it up. So I think we need to stimulate economic growth as much as possible through the tax system. I think that's one thing that we can do. I think infrastructure investment.
Just build the way they
got to build, and it doesn't have to be through public money. You know, we can leverage private money. It's gone out of fashion a little bit. You know, PFI and all the things that we used to do before, building lots of hospitals and lots of schools. Now, it may not have been a perfect system, but we got lots of hospitals and lots of schools out of it, and we don't get them anymore. So, you know, let's look at more creative ways of leveraging money into this country so that we can build the roads and build the broadband infrastructure and build homes. Yeah. So I think there are things that we can do if we look at the economy as being the centre of everything else. I think there are things that we can do to stimulate that. But in the longer term, there's something that's even more important than the economy and even more important than housing, and that's education. Because that everything starts with that. You know, the economy of 25, 30, 50 years down the line, and the engineers and the builders and everybody who's going to contribute in 25, 30, 50 years down the line, they're currently in the school system, and the school system is woefully underperforming.
And we've got to be one of the best in the world if we're going to compete in a highly competitive marketplace.
Short-term economy, long-term education. That's where the focus has got to be.
Wow.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thanks so much, Andy. I think we've taken a lot away from that conversation. It was just been so interesting to listen to all of your insights.
Delighted to be here.
Do you want to give a shout out to where people can find out more about you and what you do?
Well, various different places with my many hats that get worn all the time. So, Message Matters is the lobbying and PR consultancy. So people can have a look at Message Matters or look for me, and it won't be far away. I do net zero consultancy as well with Zero Matters, which is a bit of an offshoot of Message Matters. And of course, this is it's great to be on this podcast, but as you'll know, there's a political podcast as well called Holyrood Sources, which I do, which can be found on all the same platforms that the ESPC podcast can be found as well. So yes, I won't be hard to find if anybody's looking for me. Put it that way.
I think you need to start housing and economy matters, Andy.
I think that might be right.
With some really creative things there today. But no, thank you for being so generous with your time and your ideas and your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me in.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Wow, there we go, Andy Maciver. I'm lost for words. It's just like, that was a lot, and it was great. I think I always say we cover a lot of ground, but my word, we did today. I thought Andy went into great detail, and his depth of knowledge about the history of the Scottish Parliament and where we are now and what might be coming is just phenomenal. I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spoke a lot about some of the bills that are coming up. We have some information on ground source heat pumps, district heating systems, all the things that we chatted about on our website. So I will put all the links to the relevant articles below so people can read a wee bit more about them.
Yeah, we've also got an article coming out about the Heating and Buildings Bill and what it might mean. So that's due out soon. So again, keep an eye out for that on the news section of ESPC.com.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to listen to more episodes, wherever you're listening, you'll be able to find out more. If you are listening via ESPC.com, we have all of our episodes on there too, so you can have a listen to our back catalogue. But otherwise, we will be back same time, same place next week.
We will see you then. Thanks for listening and watching. See you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.